Hi, I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, and this is the first Libertarian Angle for the year 2017. I'm joined, as always, by my co-host, Richard Ebeling, who teaches economics at the Citadel. Richard, Happy New Year, and welcome back for another year of Libertarian Angle.
It is great to be back with you, certainly, for another year of these sessions, and I would like to wish our viewers, our listeners, the happiest of New Years, and that 2017 be perhaps better than 2016.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. That we seem to have hoped that every year of FFF's existence that things would be better, and unfortunately, it looks like as each year went by, things got worse.
Now, wait a minute. You start advocating liberty and freedom is lost in America. You're not suggesting this is causation, are you? I hope this is correlation.
Now, look, what we do is things keep getting darker and bleaker. We are the little candlelight. We are the ones that are lighting the darkness with uncompromising messages on liberty. And I'm more convinced than ever that that's what's going to bring the shift. I mean, there's a reason why we do shows like this, and why do libertarians write articles and publish books and so forth? Because they have that conviction that ideas matter, that they can shift society. And so I think we have a very good chance of doing that. Look at the Trump phenomenon. Many of the people that supported Donald Trump are obviously discontented with what's going on in America. That's something good. I'd be depressed if everybody was happy with the state of affairs. You know, the fact that people are like unhappy and they know something's wrong, that's a good sign. Now, that doesn't make them libertarians, obviously. But when people are unhappy, discontent over the situation, then they tend to start looking for answers. And we libertarians have the answers. We know. We're like a physician. You know, guy goes into a doctor's office, he wants a diagnosis as to what's ailing him, what's the problem. If the doctor gets the diagnosis wrong, the likelihood is that he's going to get the prescription wrong. And that's what's been going on in America during the entire 27 years of FFF's existence, that the quacks are over there, diagnosing the problem as, the free enterprise system in America is the problem here. We need more regulations is the prescription, or we need more welfare, more socialism. Well, they've misdiagnosed the problem, and then, of course, the medicine is the poison that they've been prescribing. We, on the other hand, as libertarians say, look, here's our diagnosis for what ails the body politic: socialism, interventionism, imperialism, militarism. That by embracing those things, that you have brought on this ailment of the body politic in America. And there's only one solution, and that's economic liberty, individual freedom, free markets, free enterprise, which necessarily entails a dismantling of the infringements on liberty. And I continue to believe that when people are ailing, they tend to search for the truth and for the right answer, and that's where we come in. And that when enough people reach that critical mass, then that's what brings the shift in society.
Yeah, I agree with you. To recall that famous opening line to Charles Dickens' The Tale of Two Cities, it was the best of times and it was the worst of times. On the one hand, one can almost say, metaphorically, certainly perhaps not literally, that it's the worst of times, in the sense that the trends have continued towards larger government, heavier tax burdens, increased regulation, a continuation of foreign interventionism. But is the best of times in the sense that you've just suggested, that there are more people who are questioning, doubting, frustrated, angry about the directions in which the country has been moving. And in fact, I would say that it is right now most important for the clear classical libertarian message to be presented in an articulate and persuasive and convincing and consistent way, The reason I say this is that the left realizes very clearly what is at stake. You see this in the panic on the part of Obama and the Democratic members in Congress, for instance. They're huddling together to determine how to shore up and protect Obamacare from repeal. They're denouncing Trump's stated appointees for various cabinet-level positions, that they're going to do away with this protection for workers, and they're going to leave the poor unsecured without safety nets. In other words, they realize that the opposite of what they desire, the interventionist welfare state, is individual liberty, voluntary association, and minimal government. And they understand the stakes, that what the opposite is saying sounds like the rhetoric of the free market and the call for diminished government. The problem is that those on the other side, by which I mean those that are now getting in the circle around Trump for the incoming administration, often sound like the rhetoric of limited government and greater free markets and personal freedom. Lowering taxes, looking into the heaviness of regulation, allowing forms of choice, as we've talked before in our podcasts about school choice and so on. But the fact is that the left realizes the threat to the loss of paternalism, but the supposed critics of paternalism actually don't want the end of paternalism. They're calling for an efficient management of the regulatory system so that it's more pro-business in stimulating industry and economic development where they, the new incoming planners in Washington, D.C., think the economy should grow. They're the ones who say, yes, there's a heavy-handed socialist inefficiency in the current Obamacare system and related government intrusions into health care. But what we want to do is we want to save certain aspects of it, and we want to sort of make it more open to degrees of business-like efficiency, again, with consumer opportunities. But the idea of abolishing, repealing, calling for the end of government involvement in these activities, they are not for that, and they will not pursue that policy. So the enemies of liberty understand more clearly what is at stake and what they want to fight the prevention of, whereas the stated rhetorical proponents of freedom neither understand the logical conclusion of calling for liberty, nor do they have a program or an agenda for even wanting to establish it. And this applies also to the realm of foreign policy. The Obama administration has followed an interventionist foreign policy of its own type, following the footsteps of George W. Bush and Bill Clinton and George Bush Sr. and all the way going back. And all that the incoming Trump administration is offering is, again, more business-like, efficient, cost-efficient ways of managing America's global presence in the world by cutting better deals with our friends and our foes. This is not a policy of non-intervention, either at home or abroad. So the proponents of collectivism and statism and interventionism understand more what they want to prevent from happening than the supposed rhetorical friends of freedom are willing to defend or actually attempt to implement.
Yeah, well, let's talk about foreign interventionism then. I mean, this is obviously going to be a big area as it has been for many, many years. This is an area where I think libertarians have the possibility of making a tremendous advance, along with the drug war, which is a domestic issue. But we've gone through, at least 25 years of constant killing, death, destruction, bombing, assassinations, 4 or 5 deployments of troops in Iraq and Afghanistan. We've seen regime change operations in Iraq, in Libya, in Syria, all over the Middle East, Egypt. Well, we see support of brutal right-wing dictatorships. If there's anything that people should be tired of, it's this concept of interventionism. And
yes.
But I think what's really important here, Richard, is as libertarians, is that we not settle for just minor reforms, like reducing the Pentagon's budget by 10%, that we really make the case for the full philosophy of non-interventionism. And that we don't sit there and say, oh, well, maybe we should intervene in some countries where for humanitarian reasons, for example, but Iraq's a disaster. That was a mistake. In other words, none of this selective concept of interventionism, but instead that we paint the picture of a full philosophy of non-interventionism where the federal government simply lacks the authority under, let's say, the Constitution to go abroad and do what John Quincy Adams called in search for monsters to destroy. And the reason that I think it's important to paint that picture is because unless people think about an idea, that they're never going to reflect on it. They're never going to digest it, mull it over, and say, wow, that is a good idea. You mentioned school choice. I mean, it's a perfect example. If all people think about is vouchers, and they think, well, that's the only thing really that you can have a free society with vouchers, that's all they're going to think about. I mean, that's naturally going to be the case. But if all of a sudden somebody comes along and says, hey, think about this. How about separating school and state entirely, just removing government from the educational arena? The person may say, oh, that's crazy, that's ridiculous. But at least he has now been exposed to a new idea that enables him to start thinking about it. If he never hears about the idea, the chance of thinking about it and ultimately adopting the idea is non-existent. And that's why we need to keep, on the foreign interventionism part, keep talking about what non-interventionism is all about. And so, I mean, this really was the philosophy of America. It was the founding philosophy of America. Now, we know about, Manifest Destiny, the wars against the Native Americans, the Indians, the expansion of the nation across the continent. But there was always this sense that America would never become an empire, would never adopt colonies, would not go abroad and involve itself in foreign wars and civil disputes, domestic disputes within nations, civil wars, that America would just stay out of this. And that philosophy was best encapsulated by John Quincy Adams' famous speech on the 4th of July in 1821 to the Congress. It's called In Search of Monsters to Destroy. It's online. It's a great speech. It's really worth reading. But what he's saying is that, look, America is going to be devoting itself to a free society. Now, we know there were exceptions. There was slavery. There was tariffs. There was land grants to the railroads and so forth. But basically, the idea was that we're going to spend our efforts establishing a free society here at home. We know a lot of bad things happen around the world. There's civil wars, there's dictatorships, there's tyranny, there's starvation, there's famines, there's wars between nations. But America itself would be limited to self-defense. If a nation attacks the United States, we will defend ourselves. But we're not going to get involved in European wars. We're not going to get involved in Asian wars. We're going to establish a free society. Now, interestingly enough, they also said, if anybody wants to flee these lands where these things are taking place, there is one place that you can come that won't return you back to your country, and that's the United States. And that was where the concept of open borders comes in. So they said, we won't save you by sending troops abroad to attack your countries, invade, bomb, assassinate, but we will provide a sanctuary for those of you that wish to escape and are able to do so. We obviously do not have that kind of foreign policy, and my diagnosis is that's what one of the principal ailments of the body politic is, the abandonment of that philosophy of non-interventionism in favor of foreign interventionism on a massive scale, in favor of an empire where we have now control countries all around the world. We put our people in public office and so forth, and this philosophy of interventionism in disputes all over the world.
Yeah, I'd like to amplify your comments with two sort of additional thoughts. One is that those who criticize the type of non-interventionist approach that you have just proposed or enunciated or reminded us of its general role in American history have attempted to paint such advocates of non-intervention as, quote, isolationists, as if the idea is that America will hunker down and isolate itself from the rest of the world, believing that alone in its cave, the tempests and storms of the outside world can't touch us, and that this is an illusion. Well, I think that one has to understand the dangers and the abuses of rhetoric and language. The classical liberal, the libertarian, the advocate of freedom and limited constitutional government, has never called for the isolation of the United States from the rest of the world. Indeed, from the time of George Washington's farewell address, trade and commerce and intercourse with the world, but foreign entanglements, by which was meant military and political entanglements, with none. The idea is that America is an open society, both within its borders and to the rest of the world. The idea that we trade with other nations, not just in goods and services, but the exchange of culture, ideas, scientific accomplishments and contributions. We believe, as advocates of liberty, in an interdependent and interconnected world of trade, commerce, industry, supply and demand, production and consumption, through this intricate network of the global system of division of labor that mutually benefits all through the peaceful enterprises of production and exchange. What the classical liberal and the libertarian has opposed is the idea that it is the duty and responsibility of the United States government to politically and militarily proceed to go outside the territories of the United States, the territorial boundaries of the United States, and to be pursuing nation building, or as John Quincy Adams said, fighting political and military monsters in other parts of the world. Now, the issue then comes up. How do Americans who feel strongly and sincerely about the hardships and the tragedies of peoples in other places, how do they manifest this? Well, just as the classical liberal and the libertarian says that, yes, there are people who fall upon hard times, not of their own making, who have personal tragedies and incapacities, and that is the role and importance of private philanthropy, private charity, not just because it is consistent with the principle of liberty, that is, you may not take the wealth or the income of another from one to give to another because you think it will be right or just. Not only is that immoral and inconsistent with individual liberty to oneself and one's property, but from a utilitarian point of view, it is inconsistent with the most efficient and self-centered way of seeing that the help that you may want to give to others by yourself or in conjunction with others in some association or group, that it is targeted in the most efficient and effective way to assist those who you believe needs the help. And by making charity competitive, you open the door to attempting to make it more effective and more efficient and more successful in the eyes of donors upon whose financial generosity you're dependent. Now, I would argue that parallel or consistent with that is the idea of foreign tragedies abroad. If an American feels truly moved by the economic hardships of others in other parts of the world, then they are free as individuals or in voluntary concert with others to pool financial resources to assist those who live in abject poverty or disease. If there are wars or civil wars or despots in other parts of the world, any American should be at liberty as a private citizen to go about leaving the United States and assisting those whose oppression they are concerned with or who feel that some other nation has been unjustly and immorally invaded by an aggressor, and to help those who they feel are oppressed and aggressed against with financial support or even their own voluntary assistance to serve in the cause against the oppression or the invader. We already see that in American history. There were philanthropists and adventurers who went off and participated in the revolutions of South America against the Spain, who joined as private individuals in fighting in Simón Bolívar's armies to throw out Spanish conquest and rule. We saw that in the Spanish Civil War of the 1930s when American leftists, yes, there were many socialists and communists But they left the United States and they joined the side that they consider better than Franco's fascists as a private choice with no government support. And they chose to fight on the side of the Republicans, who were basically the socialists and the communists against the fascists. But that was their private choice to risk their lives in a cause that they believed in without forcing other Americans to risk their blood or to have to pay for their good works as they saw it through taxpayer dollars. There is no reason to think, and we have seen it. If I can just use one more example, Jacob, those Westerners, including Americans or Western Europeans, who have attempted to join the Islamic State have been stopped or been arrested because they were viewed as joining the terrorists, the theological totalitarians, which, by the way, the Islamic State is. It's totalitarian and terrorist. But there has been no objection, you've noticed, to that admittedly much smaller handful of Westerners, Americans and Europeans, who have gone through Turkey to join the Syrian and Iraqi opposition, particularly the Kurdish forces, who are fighting the Islamic State. No one has attempted to stop them. Several of them have now died, a couple of them not too long ago, in fighting. That is the moral way. If you feel called to serve a good cause, or as you perceive the good cause in another country, then it is your right as a free individual to do so, but not expect your fellow countrymen who do not share your values, who do not believe that the cause is worthwhile, to shed their blood or to give their financial resources to benefit you. Because you see, the cause that you consider good, some other American or any other person in the world may consider to be unworthy of such support and such cost of either lives or fortunes. And therefore it should be left up to private choice and, if you will, ultimately individual conscience, and not dragging an entire nation into a cause that you might be willing to volunteer for, but others may not. That is the only way that such foreign intervention can be justified, because then it is the privatization of foreign policy. You as a private individual, you may join foreign causes that you consider worthy, but you may not expect or demand or insist that your own government take the lives and the fortunes of others to support a cause you believe in, which those others may not.
Those are excellent points, and you start out with your reference to isolationism and how, when we bring up the concept of noninterventionism, the interventionists really smear our side by calling us isolationists, which is really a strange thing, because actually it's their concept that results in isolationism. That is to say, here today you have this gigantic national security establishment, giant military establishment, CIA, NSA, that go abroad in search of these monsters to destroy. And they whether it's Al-Qaeda or ISIS or Saddam Hussein or whoever it happens to be, they go into these countries and they start killing people. And they bomb people and assassinate people, and they ignite these fires of violence wherever they go. And then inevitably people are going to retaliate. Now, we can say they don't have a right to retaliate. We can say it's wrong for them to retaliate, that they should just die at the hands of the U.S. government, that they should not do anything in response. We can concede all that. But the reality is that all too often people do retaliate. And they retaliate oftentimes in terms not just of military attacks, because they're faced with the strongest military in history. They go after the civilians, and they say, okay, this is where we can hit you hardest. And they have the 9/11 terrorist attacks, or the truck attack in Berlin because Germany was helping the U.S. in the Middle East. And then the authorities then use those terrorist attacks and the threat of terrorism to raise walls around America to protect us from those dangerous foreigners. So as you build these walls, whether they're literal walls like Trump wants to do, or figurative walls in terms of immigration controls, visa restrictions, and travel restrictions into the United States, or tariffs, trade wars, there is where the isolationism is coming in. So they have this expansionary government, unlimited government with unlimited powers that is stomping around the world, but then isolating the private sector with these walls that are keeping us from interacting from the people of the world. We libertarians want to do it the exact opposite. We want to do it the way America was founded on, where the private sector is unleashed to go around the world and interact with people, not with bombs and missiles and so forth, but with trade, with cultural groups, with charitable groups, where we're just peacefully interacting with people on a private basis, but where we're bringing the government back and constraining it in a limited function. I mean, that's what was originally meant by limited government, government whose powers are limited. And among those limitations are you cannot go abroad and stomp on people or bomb people, assassinate people, and intervene in foreign affairs. So it's the exact opposite. And that's what people need to understand about noninterventionism. We oppose isolationism. We favor open borders, free trade, where Americans are free to travel around the world. And as you point out, also get involved in foreign affairs. If they're upset, for example, of communists that are fighting to take over South Vietnam in the 60s, they should be free to travel to South Vietnam and join up with the South Vietnamese forces and fight. Just keep the government out of it. And that way, the private sector continues to operate with cultural groups, music groups, and trade and interaction with people, charitable activity, while the activities of the government are isolated to right here in the United States.
Yes, I think that the point that you made just a moment ago, that we intervene, those whom we fight against fight back, and often they do so precisely because the overpowering military strength of the U.S. to go for what is, sort of hitting below the belt, as the phrase used to be, going after soft, unarmed, innocent civilians through these terrorist attacks. This itself is inevitable from the foreign intervention. There's the old adage, the friend of my enemy is my enemy. It is inescapable that when the United States intervenes in any place in the world, politically and militarily, that it by necessity ends up taking sides. Since there's always political differences, disputes, and conflicts in other countries, just as there are political differences and disputes here in the United States with those who hold different ideological and policy ideas. So when the United States goes in militarily or politically into any country and supports side X, you inevitably make side Y your enemy, because they view you supporting their opponents within their own country. And do not be surprised, therefore, that since they now view you as the enemy, since you're the friend of their enemy, that they take action against you of often despicable and unjustifiable and cruel and cowardly types. The only way to prevent that is not to undertake this intervention, because they inevitably will do so. And you exacerbate and intensify the problem. Let's take one example of the recent times as well. You mentioned Syria and Iraq, but let's not forget Libya. Now, Muammar Gaddafi was a tyrant and a dictator in Libya. He oppressed people, he killed people. It may or may not be true, as these international tribunals attempted to sort out and claim that he supported terrorists who blew up that commercial airliner over Lockerbie, Scotland, a good number of years ago. But he certainly was domestically a tyrant and a brute, an interventionist, a redistributor in his own land, in which people had very few of what we take for granted as personal or civil liberties. But what happens? The British and the French and then the United States decide to intervene in this country. And what was the unintended consequence of this? Overthrow the tyrant, help the people. Libya has fallen apart into these principalities of tribal groups, all vying for power and position to gain their own economic strength because of the oil fields in different parts of Libya. Has the killing stopped? Has the brutality stopped? Have the murders stopped? No. You've merely splintered it into 1,000 directions, given that you've now thrown over one tyrant. Now, in the abstract, is it good that a tyrant like Muammar Gaddafi is sent to wherever he's going to go in another world? Yes. Everyone should desire to see the end of despotism and tyrants and dictators. But the fact remains is that if change is going to occur for the better, or even for the worse, It must be left to the hands of the people in those countries. Because just as you cannot centrally plan society's changes and developments here in your own country, it becomes even more ludicrous and absurd when you go thousands of miles away to try to centrally plan the future of other countries through illusions of nation building and nation repairing. You just make the problem worse. You exacerbate the tragedies of those societies. And unless we learn those lessons, we're just going to be following this path, and we may not intervene in a big way in another country for 5 years, for 10 years, but as long as the premise is there, just as the premise was never overthrown after the embarrassing and humiliating defeat in Vietnam, after a certain number of years pass by, the germ of the premise reasserts itself in interventions in other places.
Yeah, and you know, people often say with respect to Syria, for example, the interventionists, that, oh, we should have gone in there and just gotten rid of him entirely. Well, that's what they did in Libya, as you point out, and look at the result. And yes. I remember George W. Bush used to say the world is better off without Saddam Hussein. Well, as you point out in the abstract, that may or may not be true. I mean, that's something that, you know, that it's difficult to measure. But one thing's for certain: the people who were killed in the process of getting Saddam Hussein, they can't answer that question whether the world is better off without them, because they're dead. But certainly their loved ones might say, you know, maybe it wasn't worth it, because tens of thousands of people have been killed in the process of that regime change operation. World War I, total defeat of Germany. And yet what was the result? Adolf Hitler, 15, 16 years later. So whether interventionism is partial and a failure or a success, I mean, Chile's another example. They oust Allende from power, and they end up with this 17 years of brutal, horrible dictatorship involving rapes and murders and executions and disappearances under the Pinochet regime. So this is the whole history of interventionism: death, destruction, violence. And Richard, let's not forget what happens here at home. They have to take away our freedom here at home in order to protect us against these threats that they've now produced with their interventionism. The power to assassinate Americans, the power to detain Americans indefinitely under military control, the surveillance of the NSA. All of this is justified because the terrorists might come and get us. So that's the point that we need to keep stressing, is that if Americans want to rid themselves of these infringements on liberty, if they want to establish the basis for a free and prosperous society, the first step, and it's a fairly easy step, is just bring all the troops home. Especially bring them home from the Middle East where they're killing people. But I say bring them home from everywhere. Bring them home from Europe. World War II is over. No need to keep occupying Europe. Bring them home from Korea. Bring them home from Africa. Bring them home from Latin America and discharge them. And so there, all of a sudden, you have the framework for what the founding fathers envisioned was which was a foreign policy of non-interventionism and a prosperous society, because now you're not having to pay all the money for these troops and their interventions.
Absolutely. The only solution to this is to recognize that it's the underlying premise. Just as the classical liberal libertarian calls for non-intervention at home, out of respect for the rights of the individual to his life, his liberty, and his honestly acquired property, and that this not only diminishes, if not eliminates, coercion in human relationships domestically, it at least minimizes it and gives people the greatest potential latitude of freedom to pursue their own ends peacefully with their neighbors through the commerce of the marketplace. The same principle should apply internationally. That is, the United States should limit itself to its assigned duty of protecting the life, liberty, and honestly acquired property of American citizens from clear and immediate and direct foreign aggression against the United States, which is not likely to be occurring in normal circumstances, but which you create the potential for when you go out looking for enemies to fight in the name of following, quote, good progressive causes and nation building and nation changing in the name of an ideal of a progressive, better world. And in this case, both conservatives and liberals in the modern sense, all follow such a progressive agenda that is the duty and the destiny of the United States to pay policemen of the world. You see this in all the editorials in the New York Times, in the Washington Post, in the LA Times, all of these left-of-center newspapers, right, American liberal newspapers, who have lambasted this and that and the other. Now, when Trump even suggests that the United States will just reduce its international presence, all of them become imperialists, advocating global leadership, global policemanship. In other words, that which they supposedly is opposed, they now are begging for the retention of, because it's America's role to be the global social engineer.
Right. I mean, and I think we're going to see more of that now. But on the flip side, there was a fantastic op-ed in the LA Times by Elizabeth Cobbs, a professor at Texas A&M. I advise everybody to take a look at. I forget what the name of it, but just Google Elizabeth Cobbs, LA Times Foreign Policy. It's something about the founder's vision for America's foreign policy. And she outlines what you and I have been talking about. But what's interesting is she cites a Pew Research Organization poll that says that 57% of American people say no more foreign meddling. Let the world figure out the solution to its own problems. And this is up 3 percentage points from a few years ago. So if we can keep getting that number up of people that want no more foreign meddling up to, say, 65%, 70%, we may be very well looking at a major shift in our lifetime. Richard, we're about out of time. Let me thank our supporters for the great support you've given us over the years. The 27 years you've kept us going. I want to especially thank you for your end-of-year support. It's been fantastic. We're very, very grateful. It's that support that enables us to do shows like this and to put out our FFF Daily and our Future of Freedom publication, have conferences, on-the-road seminars, and so forth. If you forgot to make a donation and would like to be one of the first ones for 2017, we would welcome that. But in any event, I wanted just to tell you how grateful we are. Richard, enjoyed the last year and look forward to doing another year with you on Libertarian Angle.
Absolutely. Until next time. And again, thank you to our viewers and listeners.